Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Um, my name is Henry Harding. I'm here today to talk about the island of Denmark, which no, I'm going to let's go there. Here we are. Yes, I'm here to talk about the idea of memory and forgetting in the Persian community, with particular focus on the recently refurbished museum in the island of Denmark, in Abu Dhabi in the UAE, in Arabian Gulf. We're going to do. We aim to explore how communities sift and select through their collective memory, and how and indeed whether this should be reviewed. All communities are selected and they choose to memorialize. So what we're going to do, I'm going to look at what collective memory is, how is it created, how is it tied to notions of identity. Then I'm going to give you a little bit of background to Delma, to its history, to the development of the museum, and the kind of histories it displays and the kind of collections it has. And from there, I'm going to examine the elisions and the gaps in the story and how those came about and how you might change them in the future. And again, if they should be. So we have a nice series of quotes here about the notion of mnemonic communities. Zerubbabel states that about collective memory, rather than a mere aggregate of the personal recollections of its various members, a community's collective memory includes only those shared by its members as a group. As such, it involves a common past that they all seem to recall. And this notion of mnemonic communities, for me, is very important, especially when it comes to museums, because all museums are created for a community, sometimes by a community, well, that's a whole different debate. But they're basically mnemonic institutions. They're one of the ways that communities create their identity. And again, collective one, collective memory is actively and continuously constructed. Just as autobiographical memory serves as a primary function of defining the individual self, collective memory serves as identity and makes possible the continuity of its social life and cultural cohesion. And finally, this quote from Roger, which again I not quite like: remembering or forgetting is doing gardener's work, selecting and pruning. Memories are like plants. There are those that need to be quickly eliminated in order to help others burgeon, transform, and flower. And as we'll see later, collective memory is often just as much about what we forget or choose to select out as what we choose to remember. Again, when we come to museums and collective memory, museality, I would argue, is where objects and collective memory come together. We're taking in items from everyday life, we're musealizing them, the object changes, its significance changes, and it becomes they become objects of memory, let's say. And of course, museums, being based around the selection and display of artifacts from the past, that's one of their main, not so much functions, but one of the main jobs that museums do. They're sites where the past and thereby collective memory is edited, pruned, and exhibited, and thereby continually renewed and reconstructed. And that's how, in a nutshell, I would argue that they reconstruct our collective identity as mnemonic communities. Mnemonic communities, by the way, it could be national, it could be local, it could be as members of a particular group, but in this case, we're going to talk about a Persian community. And as you'll see here, this is a map of the United Arab Emirates. That little dot on the left is Delma Island. It's very small. It's about, from memory, 87 square kilometers. It's about 200 kilometers due west of Abu Dhabi, which you can see there on the map. Today, the island is pretty much forgotten. Very many people who've heard of it. The population is around about 3,000 people. And again, like a lot of rural communities, the young people who've gone to the city, the only people left are the ones. But Delma used to be extremely important to Abu Dhabi and to the history of the lower Gulf. The reason is that it's the only island for miles around that has fresh water year-round. It's due to a quirk of geology. But because of that, it was an important node in trade networks spanning the Indian Ocean. And I'm talking about the pearl trade. Pearling has been carried out for centuries, but during the long 19th century, it assumed a very particular form. Over that period, capitalism and empire reshaped Gulf societies very considerably, which I'll get onto in a minute. And they imposed a very specific form of debt peonage. Now, Delma was the site of an annual fair for the season. Profits and debts were settled, and merchants and capitalists came from as far as Bombay to collect on their money and buy goods. And pearling was based on bonded labour, and debt was the instrument of control, which I'll explain a bit more in a second. Now, Beit al-Marahi, which means Marahis house, that was built by a pearl merchant called Muhammad bin Jas al-Marahi. Around about 1903, we think, but there's not many records. And it was built as the business headquarters of a pearl merchant. It's got 2 stories, which doesn't sound big, but when you consider that every other building on the island was made of palm frond, in its day, it was the equivalent of a businessman building a big skyscraper. The building is based on, there's storerooms on the bottom, no windows. But the upper floor is what they call a majlis, or the best room. And that was the diving court and the dealing room for pearl business. Now I'll go into, I'll have a quick excursion into how the pearling trade was structured. Basically, it was based on a cascade of debt. We'll start with the capital debts. A lot of them came from India. Some of them were local to the Arabian Peninsula, but they were a mixture. They would lend money out to a ship's captain. The captain, in turn, would lend money to the divers. And there was a whole different range of roles in the crew. There were divers, there were people who pulled them up, there were cabin boys, there were various other roles. And at the end of each season, the catch would be taken to Delma Island, sold, and then divided into pairs according to your role. And at the end, you either paid off your debts, or if you didn't have enough money, it rolled over at a very high rate of interest, incidentally. And that way, if you were a pearl diver, it's pretty difficult to leave your job, because if you owed money, you had to go back next season and try and clear it off. And there were people, in some cases, these debts were permanently stopped around about 1930. The bottom fell out of it, partly because culture pearls were made in Japan. But anecdotally, there are stories of people paying off those debts until the 1950s or 60s. Now, there was supposed to be a system of courts. You could have disputes if you say, oh, no, this man owes me money, no, this creditor is wrong, etc. So there was a diving court. It was the only standing court at that time, and that the late 19th century, early 20th. And the judges were appointed by the ruler, but they were often captains or merchants themselves, so they had a certain interest. They weren't necessarily entirely disinterested. Also, they weren't salaried officials, but they took donations for giving of their time. So it was very easy, given the class disparities, and the fact that the divers were poor, almost all of them were illiterate, and often things just degenerated into bribery. Now, moving back to the museum, we don't know exactly when it became a museum. We think probably the first iteration started in the 60s. People started to collect things, but it wasn't formally established as a museum for a while. The building, which is one of the oldest in Abu Dhabi, by the way, in the whole emirate, that was refurbished in 1993 and again in 2020 under the Department of Culture and Tourism for my work. It reopened in 2023. A lot of the curatorial component had to be done during COVID, so access was a little bit difficult. The island, as you saw, is quite far, and it takes about 5 hours to get there. 3 hours driving, 2 hours on ferry. The building is now arranged into two galleries, one on diving and pearling, one on delving world. Those are in the old storerooms. And the matchless has been restored. Here we go. Should be a nice picture. Yeah. Now, this exhibition had no, it's put together by the committee, but there was no curator. And they had very much a show everything approach. So we needed to do a little bit of streamlining. The collections were quite varied. We have lots of ethnographic material, quite a lot of archaeology, and quite a lot of natural history. The island has a lot, as I say, the geology of the island is very interesting, a lot of rocks, interesting examples, things like that. But in order to redevelop the exhibition, we had to streamline. We had to develop more definitive themes and try and group the objects to make a little bit more sense, to match themes and tell stories. But one thing that was missing in the collection was anything to do with debt. It struck me as very interesting because it was crucial to the whole pearling story. And that's a story I want to explore. Why? Now, there are several reasons why communities might choose to forget certain things, or good, by the way, not necessarily sinister. It can be from shame, it can be to keep social peace. But I would argue it's not so much due to deliberate oversight as to the physical nature of items and as to the continual reconstruction of the community sense of self, both in Delma and in the UN more widely. First of all, debt's immaterial. It's very hard to record, especially paper. Doesn't survive well in our climate. It's 50 degrees there at the moment, 100% humidity. So I'm not complaining about weather outside. It's also a largely oral culture that we're talking about. There was every incentive on the part of the debtors not to keep records. And there's not much continuity now between the large systems. When pearling fell out, a lot of the big merchants went bankrupt. There's been an exodus to the cities, and there was nothing, in short, that we could find. So in the end, we did tackle the topic, but we created an animation, like a historical drama thing. But I would argue this is interesting in itself because it creates it's indicative of a reforming of identity. The UAE is an extremely new country. It was founded in 1971 and brought together various communities that were variegated by origin, by outlook, and by their way of life. Not all of them were Kurdish, some of them were desert people, some mountain people. And since then, there's been a breakneck speed of development. Whole new cities arising from the desert, skyscrapers, you name it. And of course, people's identity has changed very rapidly as the country has changed rapidly. Diving is not particularly fondly remembered. Debt bondage is not a history that people care to remember. They would rather focus on other elements. One thing that is particularly common in Delma and elsewhere is that people prefer to focus on those transmural failings. They're simply a much better sense, they're much better fit, let me say, with the sense of self of a society. All the cities on the coast, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, others are booming, cosmopolitan, and people prefer to think of themselves as being an open, sophisticated trading nation than a debt-ridden periphery. And focusing on those sort of linkages rather than the debt that made it possible is a better fit with how people prefer to see themselves and think about themselves in this day and age. So I know that our time is running short, but please allow me to finish with another nice quote. Tell me what you forget, and I will tell you who you are. Again, Mark Roger. I would argue that collective memory is continually evolving according to the concerns of the generation doing the remembering. So is the meaning imputed to museums and the objects in them. Everything evolves slowly, or rapidly, depending on the UAE. And in this sense, I don't think you should see the absence of debt in the Delma collections as something sinister or attempt to suppress a dark past, but rather as the expression of a different sense of self to that. Certainly for the I can never say this word, musealization of these objects. as a society in the UAE and elsewhere continues to evolve, museality and the meaning and interpretation of museum collections is going to alter in line with that evolution. And thank you very much.